All right, so I'll spend just a little bit of time on this slide. I think one of the most important things is we've got an independent board, and in the medical devices sector, we've got a very experienced first-rate team that I've been able to hire from Nanosonics, where I was previously the CEO, which is a $1 billion company now in the medical devices sector. So we've got people like Robert Tiller and Farouk and Merrick, who have been through the product development process all the way through to commercialization, as well as regulatory approvals and market entry. So a real first-rate team. We've had some excellent partners with us, the Australian government, GE Healthcare, who's put in money for our clinical trials, NVIDIA, which helps with our image processing as part of their little supercomputer that's in our device, KEYSIGHT Technologies, which we'll speak about a bit later, our partnership, and the Australian Stroke Alliance, which is a consortium of which we're a part of and lucky to be a recipient of $8 million.
The next slide, please. So for imaging the brain today, the gold standard is really CT or MR, great images, but very large machines and very much stationary, nothing available at the point of care. And what you'll see on the right-hand side here is a video of our first-gen device, our first commercial unit, and it is much like an ultrasound system, so it can be operated at the bedside. It's easy to maneuver, easy to use, has a rapid scan time, and really importantly, it's safe. So there's no ionizing radiation, which means it could be used every 8 hours, every 4 hours, or more frequently for high-risk patients with no fears of damaging radiation. It is very small, it is very mobile, and it's easy to fit in places like ICU and stroke wards where there is limited real estate. And of course, where we're heading with our second gen is out in the community, road and air ambulance. Could I grab the next slide, please? So we're focusing on stroke first, and one of the reasons is because it is such a huge health economic burden. In Australia, we have around 55,000 strokes each year. In the US, that number is quite high. It's about 800,000. And then in China, it's about 4 million. And of those strokes, 2 out of every 3 will result in some form of permanent disability. 1 out of every 8 will be fatal. So the societal burden, not just on the patient, but their families, the community, is huge. But there are very effective treatments, mostly focused on restoring blood flow in the brain, and they're time sensitive. And clinicians need to understand, is it ischemic? Is it hemorrhagic? To intervene as early as possible to improve the patient outcomes, but also after that intervention to understand the response to treatment. Have there been any complications, recurrent strokes? So we have 2 products under development. Our first gen, which you saw earlier, is our cart-based system designed for in-hospital use, anywhere where CT or MR are not accessible or practical, and there are many locations. And our second gen is a helmet system designed for road and air ambulance to deliver pre-hospital stroke care. Can we grab the next slide, please? So this will give you an idea of all the different use cases. And it's important to understand, we're not trying to displace CT or MR, but really provide valuable information in all the areas, all the use cases where they're not practical. And that includes both pre-treatment, but also post-treatment. And in the post-treatment space, we're talking about patients that have received either clot-busting drugs or clot retrieval. They're in the wards, they're recovering. They might have a hemorrhagic transformation. They might have edema, swelling in the brain. And today there is no way to monitor with a device by the bedside. Really have to rely on the clinician's observation and tools like the Glasgow Coma Scale. So it's a real incremental opportunity, a value opportunity to spot complications earlier, much earlier, and intervene earlier. Now, obviously in rural and regional settings where there may be limited access to high-end CT, there is an opportunity at the front door there to support that initial diagnosis. And then where we're moving in the pre-hospital space is really bringing stroke diagnosis and treatment out into the community. And we're really targeting treatment within the golden hour. So the first hour from stroke onset, when you can have the biggest positive impact. Now, can we get the next slide, please?
So we've done quite extensive market research and looking at the health care benefits that can actually be provided to public hospitals in Australia, and we're also doing the same for the United States at this point in time. But the touch points which really come through are reduction in transportation, more efficient use of CT, improvements of being able to pull clots out, physically removing clots from the patient, blood vessels, and reduction in the length of stay. And when we add all of that up, we believe that we can receive the hospital can receive a $438,000 per annum return and saving based on the evidence that's been provided to us. So it's a financial benefit to the hospital and excludes the cost of our system. Next slide, please. So this is some recent news that we've had. We've been working with a partner called KEYSIGHT Technologies, which is a $26 billion New York Stock Exchange company. We've signed a strategic OEM agreement with them just recently. And what we've been doing is working the last 3 years with them to take the brains of our device, or the VNA as we call it, vector network analyzer, and miniaturize it to put it in the headset of the device. So you can see images on the screen there going from the belly of the device to the headset. And they've been working very closely with us with our input. Now, we've received exclusivity in the field of neuroimaging for that particular headset miniaturized VNA for the fast sweep component, which allows us to be able to have improved capture of images, as well as put into play a blood flow monitor for us called pulsatility, which is under development with us. So it's allowed us to miniaturize it, and it's allowed us to bring down the cost of goods and improve our margins for our final product. Next slide, please.
And some very, very recent news. Just over a week ago, we were awarded a $5 million non-dilutive modern manufacturing initiative grant. And this grant, you'll see on the left-hand side under the translate heading, this is an overview of the program, and it talks to all the different elements that these funds can be used to support. And that includes late-stage clinical trials, first production runs, setting up clean rooms, manufacturing facilities, payroll. There's a whole lot of elements there that will allow us to establish our commercial manufacturing capability. So it's really exciting. Obviously, in this market, non-dilutive funding is absolutely golden, and we're now working through the details of the grant, and it's subject to signing a funding agreement in the coming weeks. Next slide, please. Now, something that's been trialed throughout the world, and there's over about 35 of these, is what's known as a mobile stroke unit. This is effectively bringing the emergency department or the stroke ward to the patient, the customized multi-million-dollar truck with a 600-kilo CT in the back, delivering golden hour care. So you can see 33% of patients are being treated in that first hour, that golden hour, with this model. Unfortunately, it's not particularly scalable due to the cost and all the customization and infrastructure requirements. So that's really where our second-gen device comes into play: ultra lightweight, cost-effective, operated by trained paramedics, images transmitted through telemedicine. And we're really fortunate to be part of the Australian Stroke Alliance. We're working very closely with them. They've put us in touch with a number of paramedic organisations, including Vic Ambulance and New South Wales Ambulance, where our design team spent considerable amount of time getting to understand the environment to make sure that we're developing a device that will be easy to operate and will integrate seamlessly into the workflow. And so we're expecting more product updates on our second-gen device shortly, making great progress there. And as part of that alliance, we're receiving $8 million in non-dilutive funding through the Stroke Alliance. We've got 6.8 still to access, and as well as all their clinical expertise. We had 3 key members, Professors Jeff Don and Steve Davies, Dr. Angela Santos, join our clinical advisory board recently as well. If we grab the next slide, please.
So I won't spend too much time on this because it's pretty technical, but I think the walk away from this is that we had a foundational clinical trial that was done at Princess Alexandra Hospital. And what we were able to show was that our imaging system was able to localize a stroke, whether it's hemorrhagic or ischemic or a bleed or a clot, in comparison to CT or MRI. And if you have a look at the panels with EMV heading, you can see that we can see anatomical details. So these are the first anatomical features using microwave imaging in the world. And you can see the blue dot, which shows that it's a ischemic stroke, and a red dot, which shows that it's a hemorrhagic stroke. So we can tell the difference between the two, and we can see at high contrast, and we can see with anatomical detail. So good result all around.
Next slide, please. So now we're moving to a much larger study, circa 300 patients. We're aiming to start that next quarter, Q3. There'll be two legs to this study, a pre-validation focused on usability, hardware verification, and then we move into sensitivity, specificity validation. And at the end of this process, our expectations will be going to the FDA, the TGA, and CE marking for our first regulatory submissions to then commercialize our product, targeting calendar year 24. And you'll see a number of milestones upcoming, product developments. We're shortly putting in our ethics application, inking our first agreements with the clinical sites. We're expecting our first site to be Liverpool Hospital in Sydney. There'll be further engagement with the FDA, as well as ongoing collaborations, partnerships, and then, of course, patient enrollment. And as we start enrolling into these studies, our expectation, much like our earlier pilot study, we'll be able to provide plenty of insights and updates throughout the study. And get the next slide, please.
So this goes to what our commercial model is. We're looking at two possible approaches. One is the classical capital equipment and consumables model. We can do that directly or with a distributor, and we've been talking to a number of potential partners such as GE, Siemens, and Philips. We're looking at pricing our device to $150,000. We have a consumable cap, which we're looking to bring in tens of thousands of dollars per annum to the value of our device, and maintenance and service, which account for about 15% of the total revenue generated on an annuity basis. And we have the monthly subscription model, which you can see is all inclusive of all of those different components. Our first gen device has the potential to be in 10,200 sites. We are looking to focus on the comprehensive stroke units, which are 1,600 sites in the United States, and starting there. But if you have a look, you can see that there are substantial opportunities, as well as tens of thousands of opportunities for ambulances on the right-hand side of the slide. Next slide, please.
So before we take questions, I think the key takeaway is we believe we're in the strongest position we've ever been in, and we've got some fantastic non-dilutive cash funding sources between the ASA and that Modern Manufacturing Initiative grant. And importantly, all management and directors have significant skin in the game. So Tim, we're happy to take some questions now.
Great, thanks, gentlemen. Can you give us some colour on the price of the device and how that kind of compares with some potential competitive products out there?
Sure. So we've tried to price it similar to an ultrasound device. So mid-price ultrasound is around $150,000. So we've looked to price it there. If you're looking at CT, you're looking at upwards of $800,000, and an MRI, you're talking about millions of dollars. So we're really a fraction of the price of the CT and MRI that is traditionally being used for stroke evaluation.
And do the devices need some sort of specialist to operate them?
No, they don't. Actually, we've designed them so that it can be used on the ward by nurses. They can be used by clinicians with about half a day's training.
And the congratulations on the funding from both the government and the Stroke Alliance. Can that get you through to that commercial stage?
Yeah, it gives us a really, really good runway. So yeah, that's, I think, I'm not sure if we mentioned it earlier, but the clinical studies themselves are really low cost. So our first study with 50 patients at one site was around $350,000. So we're not looking at a huge cost for these multi-site 300 patient studies. And the grant, of course, we expect will allow us to build the machines and establish our first production run.
And there's always mention of micro-X when we mention EMV vision. So how do you see the competitive landscape?
Sure. So There's a few companies aiming to make CT or X-ray or CT based solutions smaller and more mobile. I mentioned before that currently in a mobile stroke unit is a mobile CT, about 600 kilograms. That's still very large, and we imagine even as a CT is reduced in size, to accommodate it, an ambulance would require not insignificant customization. And ambulance layouts vary quite significantly between states, let alone countries. And then, of course, you require a radiographer on board to operate it. So our value proposition is really much lighter, potentially carried in a backpack in the ambulance, can be brought out even into the patient's home, operated by the trained paramedics without requiring a radiographer, and images transmitted through telemedicine. In terms of EM, there are a handful of companies in that space. We believe we're ahead of the pack with a more mobile device, and from what we can see publicly, higher quality output and images.
And just before we finish up, what sort of data and what's the next stage with the FDA, and what sort of data do they need to see?
So we're a class 2 device, so low to moderate risk. We're going down the de novo pathway. And the interesting thing about the de novo is we need to generate data to support our claims. So it's not a 510K where we're claiming equivalence with a CT or an MRI. It's really about generating data to support our intended use, or the labeling, what we say our device can do. And as we get that ethics approval to begin these studies, we'll put out more information in the market around our ambitions for these studies.
Great, thanks, gentlemen. That's all we have time for. A really fascinating story. We'd love to have you back on later in the year.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Tim.
Cheers.
Bye.